Good evening, everyone, and I know you share my deep joy and gratitude to share this space with Professor Davis. Today we're talking about embodying resistance. Yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and this is a theme for the DC Public Library and their outreach and their programming. But Professor Davis, I think it would be good for you to just ground what that means through the lens of your experience, because embodying resistance, it can mean a lot of things, but what does that mean for you?
Well, first of all, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming, and thank you for the first overarching questions regarding how resistance is embodied, how one embodies resistance. As an activist I've lost count of the number of years now, but I often point out that my first formal activity as an activist was when I was 11 years old in Birmingham, Alabama, and we organized an interracial discussion group, which was really, really radical then. And as a matter of fact, the church where we held our meetings was eventually burned. I don't know whether there is a formula for embodying resistance. I like to think that the spirit of resistance animates so many of our activities. I've been thinking about the way in which the music that Black people, particularly in this part of the world, in the US, in Brazil, in the Caribbean, that music is really the embodiment of resistance. And I've been thinking about the fact that it's so phenomenal that so many generations, so many decades, so many centuries after the Black liberation movement was launched in this part of the world, Black people are still struggling for freedom. And that's why, that is why Black history is important. And I like to say that since we only get mostly 28 days to celebrate Black history, it's really good and wonderful that we're beginning to acknowledge the contributions of Black women that have been erased from the historical record in so many ways. So we get to talk about that during this month, Women's History Month, as well as the contributions of all women who not only have stood up for gender justice, but who have understood the connections between and among gender justice, economic justice, and racial justice. So I would actually say that there's an infinite there are an infinite number of ways in which resistance can be embodied. Those of us who see ourselves as doing the work that will bring about future ways of inhabiting the world that are characterized by freedom, those of us who are doing that work, we embody resistance. And writers embody resistance. Their work embodies resistance. Libraries embody resistance. And as a matter of fact, libraries are some of our most important institutions. And I'm so happy that in the recent period, we've been giving public recognition to the role of libraries in ways that were not always acknowledged. I can remember, see, I told you don't ask me a question because but I'll just say one thing. Growing up in the most segregated city in the country, the libraries, well, the library that we had was a refuge. And I can remember the librarian at the one black library in Birmingham, Alabama. Her name was Miss Bell. And she was one of the most important people in our community. And I can remember going to the new library. We finally got a library that was actually constructed out of brick. The first one was a kind of a shack, to tell the truth. And I remember the joy in the community when we finally got this relatively small brick building, but that was our library, and it gave us a sense of progress and progress in the recognition that liberation never happens without education. And so, embodying resistance. You see, we could go on for the next several hours talking about the ways in which resistance are.
I'm content to listen. I mean, you mentioned the erasure of women's stories, Black women's stories from history. And we're in a library at a time when libraries and schools are once again under attack. There are efforts to erase the stories of marginalized people from history, from curriculums. Anyone who followed the story knows that some of your work was removed from the African American AP Studies formal curriculum. And I mean, there are libraries that have lost funding and closed after coming under attack. What do you make of this moment in the country's history? And what are we responsible for to try to protect institutions like this one?
You know, oftentimes we don't recognize the importance of the moment until it has passed. When we're in the middle of it, we can't quite grasp its historical character. And I know that in the United States, we're not exactly encouraged to develop historical consciousness. And as a matter of fact, it has been only in this period that there's been a broad recognition of the extent to which we have been produced by history, and the extent to which there are historical tasks that actually should have been undertaken in a previous era. What I'm saying is we're involved in projects now that should have happened in the immediate aftermath of slavery. And in that sense, we're still really inhabiting the afterlife of slavery. Yeah, I think that this is a very important moment. And not only the fact that in 2020 we experienced the largest mass protests in the history of this country. And I never tire of talking about the fact that what was so extraordinary about all of those gatherings, many of which took place right here in DC, was that that we knew we were in the midst of a pandemic that had claimed so many lives, and we did not yet know how the pandemic was being driven. We did not realize, we didn't know that we shouldn't be close to each other, right? But we also didn't know about the possibility of the virus being transmitted in large crowds. And despite that, people poured out of their homes in the aftermath of the police lynching of George Floyd. And if we think about the significance of that, so many people completely forgot about their own safety. And they were only concerned with demonstrating that it was no longer possible to accept the structural racism that has defined this country for a very long time. And you know, when we think about the efforts to prevent Black studies from flourishing and developing, the attacks on the College Board curricula, I think it has to do with what I would call a counter-revolution that's underway now. A counter-revolution that is, in fact, similar to the counter-revolution that followed the period after slavery, when radical Reconstruction was underway. W.E.B. Du Bois, in his wonderful book, Black Reconstruction in America, writes about the efforts to undo what had been accomplished during the period of radical Reconstruction, and to prevent the consolidation of some of the gains that were associated with Black people and their allies struggling not only for freedom, but for a much more democratized society for all. Because during radical Reconstruction, women's rights, especially in the South, were a part of the Black agenda. And not only Black women's rights, but rights for all women around issues such as property and divorce and so forth. If you study that period, you see that that was the most radical period in the history of this country. And it is still not taught in the way that it should be in our schools. So they're afraid. And what's his name down in, what's the guy's name in Florida? No, I said, what's his name? Because I know his name.
Y'all are so helpful.
But in the African insistence on naming as being powerful. So I also like to think that we can withdraw that power by not naming. So I don't name the other guy who was, do you remember when we had this president? Anyway, so yeah, it's a part of an effort to undo the consciousness that has arisen, especially around structural racism, because for so long we've been persuaded that racism is just about people not liking people, like white people who don't like Black people. It's an individual issue. It's about character flaws, and it's not about a machinery. It's not about structures that work regardless of who the individuals are. Think about what happened in Memphis when all of the cops who were involved in the killing of Tyree Nichols were black. So that's dangerous for people such as the governor of Florida, whose name will not be pronounced in this meeting this afternoon.
I want to circle back to something you just alluded to, and that's coalition building. But I would love to hear you expand a little bit on what it means to build coalitions beyond the American lens. So when we talk about liberation, whether we're talking about race or gender or LGBTQ rights, it's often discussions through a very specific American lens. But why is it important to expand that lens and look beyond our own borders?
Well, thank you so much for that question. Particularly since in this country we are rarely reminded that we are inhabitants of a global order, and that the United States of America is not the only place in the world that matters. And sometimes it's not even the most interesting place. Given what has happened in Brazil, we're relatively close to South America, and particularly given the similarities between the governments that were in place both here and in Brazil, with maybe I shouldn't even name Bolsonaro, but in Brazil, not only were they successful in removing him, I guess we did evict the worst kind of fascism from the White House, but we'll talk about that a little later, because. But they elected a socialist president, re-elected Lula, and as a matter of fact, there is a flourishing movement in Brazil, a movement that is largely led by black women. And every time I go to Brazil, it really strikes me as bizarre that many people in Brazil, many activists, feminists, want to hear about black feminism in the US. Well, that's a good thing. But it's often at the expense of acknowledging their own history and traditions of black feminism, which we in the United States can learn a great deal from. And the assumption that the U.S. is always the greatest. Well, you hear over and over again, America is the greatest country in the world, and that's not true. America, well, first of all, the whole notion that this country can colonize the name America when it's just a country, and America is a hemisphere. It's continents. It's huge numbers of countries, and I identify with America only in the sense that it is an identity that crosses borders, not as the United States of America, which is just one little country, and that has had problems throughout its existence, and we still see the consequences of colonialism and the genocide of indigenous people that gets repeated over and over in so many other ways. And slavery, we are living the consequences of slavery. We're just now, well, those people in Florida and other places don't even want us to think about it now. But yeah, we need to develop a global consciousness and recognize that we're a part, and not only a global consciousness of connectedness with other humans, but we're connected to non-human animals as well. You know, I think that this is a period when we need to have a little bit more humility, given the vastness of the universe, and given the fact that this tiny spot in the universe, which is unfortunately been so polluted by racism and capitalism, or racial capitalism, which is the term that we are using now, and it's in the process of self-destructing, and we don't even, like, you know, I'm thinking, I love this library. It's so beautiful. But then I look at the plastic bottles that we drink water out of, and I think about the ways in which we are destroying the oceans. And so something has to change, both regarding consciousness and regarding the actual tasks that have to be undertaken in order to give humans and other species on this planet a little bit more time, because probably every species is eventually going to be extinct if we think in that kind of, you know, broad fashion. But it doesn't have to happen so quickly. And the way all the billionaires are treating it is to figure out how to get somewhere else. You know, and the SpaceX and all of these programs to colonize another planet and do the same to that.
I have to say, Professor Davis, as I'm listening to you speak, and I'm thinking about the decades of work you've done, you still seem optimistic with all you've said, with all you've laid out, and the struggles you identify ahead. What is at the core of that optimism for you?
Well, I'm really fortunate to have always been affiliated with communities, with groups, with organizations of people who believe in the possibility of a better world. So it's not an individual characteristic. But I always try to surround myself with people who not only want to engage in struggle, but who believe that it is possible for this struggle to make a difference. And that's one of the reasons why history is so important. It's one of the reasons why we should recognize what a difference libraries make, and schools, and the state of our schools now, when teachers are trained to be more attentive to discipline than to helping their students discover their own passions, to discover what they love to do. And I know that is a process that will happen. Unfortunately, many people, Black people, people of color, poor people, don't discover that until they go to prison. And then, then they realize what they have been missing. I have a cousin who just got out of prison about less than a year ago, and he was in for about 40 years. And we were out having dinner with him the other night and listening to him. He is so excited about being in the world. What he did for himself behind bars was precisely what was not done for him when he was a youngster in Los Angeles at a time when, you know, the gangs were developing and so forth. And he's not only excited to participate in, well, can I tell you a story? Sure. I hope he doesn't mind my sharing this. You know, he's been out for less than a year, and he's working a few jobs. He works in San Quentin too. That was the last place of incarceration for him. He does restorative justice work. And recently he was able to buy a car and was so excited about his new car. Somebody ran into him. Somebody made a left turn in an intersection, and it was a criminal defense attorney. But let me tell you what he did. My cousin, Tommy, when they were trying to figure out how they could resolve this without necessarily using the police to resolve it in the context of restorative justice, he, among other things, asked this lawyer if my cousin Tommy could bring him into San Quentin and allow him to participate in groups of men in prison there who have experienced tragedies in the sense of causing deaths as a result of drunk driving. I forgot to say the lawyer was drunk. So he's not only thinking about how he gets his car back and all of that, but he's thinking about creating other non-punitive possibilities for resolving these issues. And I mean, and you know, who does that? But it makes all the sense in the world. And this is someone who was totally underserved by the school system, who had to be involved in gangs and go to prison in order to learn how to read and how to think and how to resolve these kinds of disputes in non-punitive, restorative ways.
Well, that makes me wonder how you look at current movements and what leadership looks like and where we look to for answers. Whether we have moved away from more of a hierarchical structure of resistance and if something else has evolved.
Yeah, I think we're looking at different paradigms of leadership. And that became apparent in relation to the development of Black Lives Matter. When some of the old civil rights leaders, I won't name them for other reasons, not for the same reasons I'm not naming the other people I said I'm not naming, because I think they still have the opportunity to learn and to change. But, you know, some of them went to Ferguson during the protests, and their response was, well, where are your leaders? Where's your manifesto? And of course, there were a lot of women involved in those protests. Black women, women of color, anti-racist white women, and so when the veteran civil rights leaders looked at that, it didn't make sense to them because they were thinking about a context in which there would be a very clearly acknowledged, charismatic individual leader. And I shouldn't just say individual leader because they were imagining men, right? Because in those days, people like Ella Baker, who had a different idea about what leadership could be. You know, it was Ella Baker who said first, "We are a leaderful people." And we don't have to have leadership imposed in the same way, that we can develop collective leadership. And I think we're in a period now where we're attempting to develop these new paradigms. At the same time, we obviously are lacking. And, given the part played by social media, there's oftentimes a lot of confusion about, what it means to be an organizer. If you have 20,000 likes, does that mean you've done the job of allowing people to develop, urging people to develop a kind of collective imagination of what it is we need and how we're going to embark upon the process of getting there? But I think the fact that more women, more queer women are in the leadership of grassroots struggles is a really good sign. But at the same time, when we ask ourselves how change happens, it's important to realize that you sometimes do need historical perspective. And it's not always the big organizations that are responsible for change. Sometimes it's small groups that exist for a relatively short period of time, but they have an impact on the way we think about, what it means to imagine the future differently. And that is a contribution excuse me, that abolitionists have made. Oftentimes people assume that abolitionists are just for destroying things, get rid of the prison, get rid of the police. Yeah, we are for that. But it's not so simple. It's about imagining what this world would have to look like in order not to depend on such institutions of violence and repression. So it really is about rethinking and reimagining our lives and, all of the institutions. And from my vantage point, that has to be an anti-capitalist project, because capitalism, which always relied on and deepened and expanded racism, is never going to lead us anywhere near a path toward freedom, because capitalism is only concerned about, money, profits, and their vision. The capitalist vision is, it's like nearsighted. Look at what's happening right. I'm not going to go on to the bank crisis.
I'm trying to watch time, but we're talking during Women's History Month, and I'm not even sure how to ask this question. As someone who's been in the fight for liberation for so many decades, as a woman, how are you feeling right now about where we are?
Well, I think I would have to offer two different answers. One would be that I'm really excited about all of the developments that have occurred, especially recently. As an activist who has how many decades did I say? I mean, I told you when I was 11 years old, and now I am in the last year of my 70s. So I'll turn 80 next year. And so if I think about a perspective from that acknowledges the passage of time, I would say that there are things that I never imagined that we would achieve. I mean, we're talking about abolition. I spoke to a large group of high school students the other day in San Jose. And so I said, how many of you are familiar with abolition? Every single hand went up. And in the 80s and the 90s, when we were doing the hard work of trying to create abolitionist organizations and conferences, if you ask that question, nobody would raise their hand, or the prison industrial complex, or mass incarceration. So I think that we have made an enormous amount of progress in the way we think about what it is we are resisting. Because at one time it was this white person used the word to refer to black people that they're not supposed to use. Let's tell them to go to a, what do they call them?
Like a sensitivity training?
Yeah, like unlearning racism workshop.
Okay.
And now large numbers of people really do understand the structural character of racism, and that it's not so simple. So I want to embrace that, but at the same time, I want to say that it's a tragedy that it's taking so long. And I can't tell you when we will reach a point where we will have made really important strides in the effort to abolish racism, because it keeps coming back, doesn't it? I mean, we're told that, we have a black president. So that's the last barrier to racism. You remember that? But at the same time, I think it's important that we're learning so much more. We understand intersectionality, that you can't simply be opposed to racism without understanding its connections with class issues and gender issues, heteropatriarchy, the connection with the campaign around the rights of trans people. Now that is something that's really amazing. If you think about the fact that 15 years ago, could you have imagined that we would be talking about the fall of the gender binary? So what's exciting about being involved in these struggles is that, oftentimes victories happen in ways that you never could have imagined. And that is only because you're involved in struggle. Conjunctures get created, like the one that took shape in the summer of 2020, not because there was a spontaneous response of people to the police lynching of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, but because that was the cumulative effect of so many people who have been involved in these struggles over time. And I think of it as a time when many people of all racial backgrounds recognize that what they had been hearing here and there, that racism is structural, that it's a part of the institutions, that it's systematic, it's systemic, that at that moment it made sense. But it only made sense because they had heard it in the context of all of the work activists have been doing over decades. And that sometimes it takes a very long time for that work to bear fruits.
At the same time, we recently experienced the overturning of Roe v. Wade, the Dobbs decision. We see state after state implementing anti-trans legislation. It feels as if we're existing in two different countries at the same time, depending upon what state you live in. Is that sustainable for this country? Where if you live on this side of the state line, you have access to these things, it's safe for you. If you live on the other side, not so much. And what does that mean for resistance?
Well, you know, I think that we sometimes have an inaccurate sense of what victories mean. Excuse me. You know, we think that it's a one-time thing, that once we achieve reproductive rights, and actually we could talk about the problems with the organizations of the movement that led to Roe v. Wade, and what was not emphasized, and how it was conceptualized, and the fact that there were many black women, women of color, poor women who were saying at the time that we cannot represent this issue as a question of the right to privacy, but rather it's about justice. It's about racial justice. It's about economic justice. It's about reproductive justice. And so in a sense, we could have predicted that something like this was going to happen. And you know, as someone who's always been in support of women's reproductive rights, I've always been also critical about the ways in which that struggle has been represented, largely because of the influence of white supremacy, the influence of racism, and not recognizing that one cannot assume that the situation of a white middle-class woman is going to represent the needs of all people who identify as women. You know, we've been working with this assumption that the paradigm for woman is white. And we're just beginning to kind of, and that reflects the ways in which human rights have been conceptualized. The whole notion of human rights is racialized. It's racialized. You know, why is it that the American Revolution and the French Revolution get to be seen as the very paradigms of democracy, whereas the Haitian Revolution, which was far more advanced in terms of their understanding of the relationship between anti-racist struggles and struggles for democracy. So, You know, we can be upset about these things, but we have to learn from them as well. We have to learn in order not to make the same mistake over and over again. And that's why I emphasize this kind of development of a mass consciousness of the fact that racism is structural. That is really amazing. It's phenomenal. You know, even though some of us have been saying that for as long as I can remember, you know, back in the 70s we were talking about that, but it was not conceptualization that resonated among the population. So, you know, we're just here for a little while.
Well, to that end, and this is my last question before I turn it back over to you for your keynote.
But we can continue with the
well,
question.
Professor Davis said I could keep talking, so here we go. I mean, we have young people here, and it's something I want you to address because in interview after interview with young activists, they talk about the physical, mental, and emotional cost of doing the work of resistance. And in talking about embodying resistance, I think we need to acknowledge that there is a cost to the body, to the self. And for young people who are listening here, well, for all of us, what advice, what guidance would you have about the necessary rest and restoration that goes along with resistance?
Well, you know, Jen, this gives me an opportunity to point out the oftentimes unacknowledged influence of capitalist ideology, that we imagine ourselves as individuals. We think about this work as individual work. We haven't figured out how to recognize that who we are is utterly related to who our communities are, and that you know, there's very little that we can do simply as individuals, and especially not being involved in campaigns, in radical struggles for justice, for economic justice, racial justice, gender justice, climate justice. These are all collective undertakings, and we have to recognize that we are the products of those movements. We're not simply individuals over here who figure out how to go over here and participate in the movement, because that means that if we want the movement to succeed, we can't imagine it succeeding without our individual contribution, and we're going to work ourselves to death. We're going to destroy ourselves in the process. But if we imagine it as a collective process, we see that it's not so much about what I do as an individual. It's about what we all do together. And when I'm tired, of course I should rest. Of course I should rest, because the work continues. And I rely on my comrades who continue the work as I rely on myself. I don't separate myself from them. So this is the really terrible influence of individualism, that we don't know how to imagine ourselves as collectives. You know, oftentimes people talk about me as if I've done all of these amazing things. But let me tell you that there is nothing of significance that I have ever done that has not been done in community. And I only accept responsibility in the context of having worked with others. And I think that that is what we have to learn how to do. And then self-care becomes, it becomes something that we recognize we have to do, because it's about a responsibility to the community. We are responsible to our comrades, our sisters, brothers, siblings, to take care of ourselves so that we can help the community grow. But it's going to take a while to cultivate that kind of, that kind of thinking that is the kind of thinking that Ella Baker many, many years ago was urging when, who was telling me about we who believe in freedom will not rest? Yeah. You do have to, you don't rest and you do rest. And you learn how to inhabit contradictions as well. You learn that contradictions are not non-productive. Contradictions often give us precisely the impetus that we need to do the work.
Well, I have about 100 more questions I could ask you, but I'm going to turn it over to you to give your keynote now. But
Well,
Professor Davis, it's just been such a gift to talk to you.
Well, I actually have some notes here, but I don't think I'm going to open up my iPad. And I think what I'd like to say to close out this conversation, and thank you so much for the questions, and you saw that for each question I could have gone on for another couple of hours. But I think I want to go back to the question. I want to combine that question of about individualism and the way in which we are urged to think about ourselves as separate from, in the first place, separate from our community. When, as a matter of fact, we are always produced not only by the community that we can witness at this moment, but we're produced by our historical communities. We're produced by history. And in order to accurately acknowledge the success of our social justice efforts, we have to ask ourselves about the impact of what we do, not only at this particular moment, but what will be the impact 10 years from now, or 20 years from now, or 50 years from now, or 200 years from now. And of course, we don't like to think about the world going on after we're gone. And that's a capitalist phenomenon as well, right? And it's that kind of possessive, acquisitive individualism that infects the way we think about ourselves. And this is where we can learn from indigenous people and the temporalities that are about responsibility to those who will be here 500 years from now. And this is something that I think not only, well, older people don't like to think about what the world will be when they're gone. That's why death is so frightening. But I often try to imagine how people who were struggling against slavery. The ancestors of people of African descent here, and also the white ancestors, because all white people were not in favor of slavery. That's something they want you to believe, that white people have not also historically identified with struggles for freedom. And so when somebody says, you can't have this book because this book is going to make these children feel guilty, they don't see the children identifying with those who are struggling. And the fact that they have been erased from history. The John Browns and Lucretia Mott's and all of the other people. So, I try to imagine how they thought about the consequences of their action. And we know that they, of course, could not have imagined us here as we are today. But we are here, gathered here in this hall, precisely because of the work that was done by others so many years ago to end slavery, to fight for women's rights. And if we can acquire the habit of thinking more expansively in terms of identifying with people in other parts of the world, but more expansively in terms of temporality, so that we identify with those who are going to reap the fruits of the work that we do now. And that is how I think multi-generationality should unfold. That would be my message to young people. And as those of us who are a little bit older, or a lot older, we're looking toward you. Where are the young people in the audience? One of the problems is that these lights are so bright that, okay. So we are looking toward you. You are closer to the future than some of us are. And therefore, you need to provide the leadership to those of us who have to have your backs, because you're going to take this world where it needs to go. And I thank you in advance for all of the work that you're poised to do. And thank you all.
Everyone, thank you so much for coming. Please, another big round of applause for Dr. Angela Davis.